Hey everybody, this video is called Laws and Penalties, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Numbers, looking at the 15th chapter, where we're going to look at various laws in regards to the offerings, such as grain, drink, and wave offerings. So let's look at Numbers chapter 15, verses 1 through 5, starting out. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you have come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am given to you, and you make an offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering or a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow, or as a freewill offering, or in your appointed feast, to make a sweet aroma to the Lord from the herd or the flock. Then he who presents his offering to the Lord shall bring a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering. You shall prepare with the burnt offering or the sacrifice for each lamb." So the law of the grain offering is recorded here. It differs from that was given back in the book of Leviticus chapter 2. And the grain offerings in Leviticus were offered separately as a gift to the Lord. And here, for the first time, grain and drink offerings were allowed to be offered along with either a burnt or peace offerings. And what's amazing is that even though the Israelites rebelled against God and they were under judgment at this time, the Lord still planned to give them the land of Canaan, as we see in verse 2. And in verse 4, ephah and hin were measurements equal to about 4 to 6 gallons, or 6 to 8 pints. And God had not and will not give up on Israel. In verse 5, verse 6 and 7, it says, "Or for a ram you shall prepare as a grain offering 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil. And as a drink offering you shall offer 1/3 of a hin of wine as a sweet aroma to the Lord." So the sacrifice of the ram was to be accompanied with grain and wine. In verse 8 through 10, "And when you prepare a young bull as a burnt offering, or as a sacrifice to fulfill a vow, or as a peace offering to the Lord, then shall be offered with a young bull a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah in a fine flour mixed with 1/2 of a hin of oil. And you shall bring as a drink offering 1/2 a hin of wine as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord." So the sacrifice of a bull was to be accompanied with grain and wine. And both the ram and the bull offering needed a greater amount of grain and wine to accompany them, because it was bigger sacrifices. In verse 11 through 16 says, "Thus it shall be done for each young bull, for each ram, or for each lamb, or a young goat, according to the number that you prepare. So you shall do with everyone according to their number. All who are native born shall do these things in this manner, and present an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. And if a stranger dwells with you, or whoever is among you throughout your generations, and would present an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord, just as you do, so shall he do. One ordinance shall be for you of the assembly, and for the stranger who dwells with you, an ordinance forever throughout your generations, as you are, so shall the stranger be before the Lord. One law and one custom shall be for you, and for the stranger who dwells with you." So we see that every sacrifice needed to bring with the thanksgiving of grain and the joy of wine. In verse 17 through 21, "Again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land to which I bring you, then it will be when you eat of the bread of the land that you shall offer up a heave offering to the Lord. You shall offer up a cake of the first of your ground meal as a heave offering of the threshing floor, so shall you offer it up. Of the first of your ground meal you shall give to the Lord a heave offering throughout your generations. So this regulation pertained to the offering of the first fruits of the harvest. And when the people entered the land of Canaan and began to enjoy its produce, they were to show their devotion to the Lord by presenting him a cake that was baked from the first cuttings of the grain. In verse 22 through 29 says, "And if you sin unintentionally and do not observe all these commandments which the Lord has spoken to Moses, all that the Lord has commanded you by the hand of Moses, from the day the Lord gave commandment and onward throughout your generations, then it will be, if it is unintentionally committed without the knowledge of the congregation, that the whole congregation shall offer one young bull as a burnt offering, as a sweet aroma to the Lord, with its grain offering and its drink offering, according to the ordinance, and one kid of a goat as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and it shall be forgiven them. For it was unintentional, they shall bring their offering, an offering made by fire to the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord for their unintended sin. It shall be forgiven the whole congregation of the children of Israel, be the stranger who dwells among them, because all the people did it unintentionally. And if a person sins unintentionally, then he shall bring a female goat in its first year as a sin offering. So the priest shall make an atonement for the person who sins unintentionally, when he sins unintentionally before the Lord, to make atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. You shall have one law for him who sins unintentionally, for him who is native born among the children of Israel, and for the stranger who dwells among them." So sin offerings were prescribed whenever any of the Lord's commandments were unintentionally disobeyed by unintentional neglect or carelessness. In verses 24 through 26, it gives the offerings for the whole community, whereas verse 27 through 29 is the offerings of the individual person who sinned unintentionally, as stated. In unintentional sins, they required a blood atonement. In a nation's unintentional sin required a bull offering, whereas a female goat had to be sacrificed when it was an individual that was guilty. And sin was sin, and even if the motive seemed good, it must be accounted for if it was unintentional sin. In verse 30 through 31 says, "But the person who does anything presumptuously, whether he is native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among the people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be completely cut off. His guilt shall be upon him." So, does anything presumptuously is to sin knowingly and intentionally? Or doing anything presumptuously is to sin knowingly and intentionally. And it described a blasphemous because it was a arrogant act of a person of disobedience against the Lord. And anyone guilty of a presumptuous sin was to be excommunicated from Israel and put to death. And presumptuous sin is to sin with a high hand. In verse 32 through 36 says, "Now while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron, and said to all the congregation, They put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." So as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. So a little tense here. But this was an illustration of defiant sin. And when it was determined that it was a premeditated violation of the Sabbath law, the death sentence was required. And we saw that even in Leviticus and so on. And the Sabbath was a presumptuous sin if one failed to follow it. And then in verse 37 through 41, to wrap up, it says, "Again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel. Tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners. And you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined, and that you may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy for your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." So we see repeated here in the ending of chapter 15, I am the Lord your God. But the blue tassels were in the form of like a flower or a petal, and they were attached to the garments of the Israelites. And the purpose of them was to remind them of their need to trust and obey God's commands. And in verse 41, it reminds of Moses' first encounter with the Lord back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 12 through 22 in the desert. And if one was tempted to sin, the catching sight of one's garment would remind themselves of who they were, and that others can see who they are. So to wrap up, we looked at the various laws regarding the grain, drink, and wave offerings as we look at the sacrifices of the lamb, ram, and bull, and so on, and offerings that had to be accompanied with the grain and wine. And we looked at the universal character of these laws. We looked at the heave offering of thanksgiving to the Lord. And God's promise was encouraging still as God sets their mind on the promised land, as they could look forward to the promise and what life would be. And we looked at remedies for sin, such as unintentional sin as a nation, just as an individual is addressed. And many today think that if there was an action that's unintentional, that it can't be sin. Well, that's false. We still can commit unintentional sin. And that isn't always the case. And we see the presumptuous sin is addressed here as well. And we see that a Sabbath violator was to be executed, whether you believe that's justifiable punishment or not. And the law of God was to be valued, and the purpose of the law of God was to put fear in lawbreakers. And the chapter ends with reminders for God's holy people through the tassels. And now religious clothing, when we talk about religious clothing, you might think of modern day, like the Orthodox, like priests, maybe Coptic priests, or priests in general with the Catholic Church. They wear something that's like a tassel. However, man's pride can lead into an idol of a special clothing. And we see that as well later on in the gospel according to Matthew. Let's check it out, Matthew 23, verse 5. So Jesus here is laying it down on the Pharisees. Verse 5 says, "But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments." So Jesus here is rebuking the Pharisees for abusing the command to and they're walking in a self-righteous, hypocritical manner in Matthew chapter 23. So even though we read in Numbers 15 of the tassels and the clothing and everything in the Old Testament, all because somebody's walking in those clothing doesn't mean that they're holier than you, or that they're higher in position. But that's going to wrap up this video, and we'll see you next as we're going to look at Korah's rebellion on Saturday. And that's a very interesting passage that we're going to talk about on Saturday, and we can even see how it might seem like how it could fit us today. So we'll talk about Korah's rebellion on Saturday. That's tomorrow. So hope you have a great rest of your night, great weekend. God bless.